Okay, this week we're looking at how to secure yourself online, and then we're going to look at how you can use that information to be safe when you're shopping online in particular. So, learning objectives for today: be able to identify common online threats such as phishing, scams, and malware. Understand the importance of strong passwords and how to make strong passwords, etc. Shopping online safely, which we'll cover at the end. And during that session, you'll probably go on to share sort of online sites you'd recommend, which you've dealt with and you know are safe. And securing your internet connection as well. So it's secure both at home as well as when you're out and about. Finally, distinguishing between real and fake news. So being able to actually trust what you're reading and not be sort of set down some sort of rabbit hole into some sort of unusual, non-facts and so on. So let's start with some online safety. So some sort of some of the key, words which are often used. So obviously online safety is being used here, but what does it mean? It means basically simple practices to protect yourself online and also to keep yourself private so that information is not shared or stolen about you and can be used against you. For example, using your child's name, your pet's name, to work out if that's included in your passwords, things like that. Phishing scams. Well, by now you probably have created an example of a phishing letter, which fraudsters also do as emails to contact people and make them pretend that they're your bank or what have you, or trying to make people fraud accidentally reveal their private information. We're going to be looking at strong passwords, as I said earlier, and what do we mean by strong password? Well, a password which is difficult to crack or to guess. A password doesn't really have letters as words, but in what appear to be random, it has a combination of both letters, numbers, and possibly even symbols to make it even more difficult. And we're going to be looking at what is a trusted news source. Which sources can you trust generally? Which sources can you actually have confidence that they're not trying to tell you not just lies, but a slant on the truth? And a few more. We got malware. Malware is basically the new viruses. Computer viruses, as you're going to hear, don't really exist in the way they used to. But malware is very much a thing which can affect people, even when they're doing absolutely nothing wrong. And fake news. We're going to be looking at a lot of fake news. We're going to be looking at how to protect yourself and how to identify what's fake. We're going to be looking at how to check if the images are genuine. They've been used by particular organisations such as newspapers and what have you in the past. And as I say, online safety. So engaging, in activities safely on the internet. So let's start with online safety. So using, first of all, updated antivirus is really important to protect yourself. Now, the antivirus which you get with Microsoft is absolutely adequate. I've stopped recommending any second or third party antivirus software. So I certainly don't recommend Norton and some of the well-known brands because they tend to be very bloatware and very sort of slow your machine down. So absolutely just use what you've got available with Microsoft. It normally does a good job. And for malware protection, you can download quite a number of, reasonably or even free malware protection software applications, which do a good job also. And also don't bloat your computer so that you don't have like large programs running in the background slowing your computer down. Avoid sharing your personal information. So it's quite easy to have discussions online with people, but be careful because that information can be used against you in the form of using that as a basis to figure out that's in your passwords and using that to, to catfish you so that, they're pretending to be somebody people even get messages from what appear to be a child, but they aren't. They're actually a fraudster using information which has been discovered online. Targeted advertising. Now, targeted advertising is one of those things which I actually personally quite like targeted advertising, which always takes people by surprise. I would rather have adverts which, there's a possibility it might be of interest to me, might even be, a reasonable offer. But targeting advertising is one of those things you have to be aware of, because if, for example, even fraudsters can target you, and if prices seem too low, then maybe they are too low, and sometimes it can lead to some privacy concerns, particularly when you're dealing with organisations you're not already trusting, and organisations which possibly even might reflect a certain style of, say, website, make them look like they're an Amazon, make them look like they're an eBay, but in reality they could be a fraudster. There may not even be a genuine trader. They might just be trying to take your money. And again, going back to phishing scams, so be cautious of unsolicited emails, even be cautious of unsolicited letters. You never know quite who's there. Always worth checking and taking your time, even when there seems to be an urgency about a situation which you've been informed of by one of these letters or emails. And check the sender's email address. Is it real? Is it spelt right? If it's an email, say, off Microsoft, is Microsoft spelt right? If it's off your bank, is your bank email address spelt right? Or is it off a fraudster? Even if it is spelt right, doesn't mean it is genuinely off your bank. It might be worth contacting that organisation separately using a separate device, just in case that one device you're using has actually been in some way compromised. And some real world examples we'll be looking at in just a minute, particularly when you get messages off what appear to be a financial organisation such as your bank. So malware, we've already talked about malware. Malware is very much a sort of on the same tracks as a virus, but as I say, it's probably something you can be infected with without actually doing anything wrong. Unfortunately, malware exists on the internet, and just going to certain websites, malware can be injected onto legitimate websites, and there's very little you can do about it. The main thing you can do is keep your malware software up to date, because your malware software will eventually find anything which is already got onto your system and will protect you and remove it in the background without making any fuss. And just because it's not coming up all the time telling you about malware actually doesn't mean it's not working. It actually is doing a good job in the background. And probably the most important thing, especially with Windows, is to keep your device up to date. So, for example, Windows have what's called a Patch Tuesday, which is the third Tuesday in every month. And on that Tuesday, they have an updated version of the operating system. So it's definitely worth having a look and checking, if you need to, that your computer's updated. There are facilities to set your computer to update automatically. And if you know you're the sort of person who might forget to go and check manually, then it might be worth turning that little slider to update automatically on those occasions. And obviously, just talk about that. Update your your Windows automatically. Strong passwords. So strong passwords. Well, as I say, you can't really beat a strong password. So a strong password will be something which is quite large, and we're definitely going to talk about that in just a minute. It may comprise of a number of characters, capital, small, numbers, special characters, and all that sort of stuff. It's quite good. And also change your passwords frequently, and tend not to have multiple passwords or same password on multiple accounts. So don't just have one, maybe two, or even three passwords. It used to be a trend to have like three passwords, one secure, one not secure, one in the middle. That tends to be not the best recommendation these days, because once passwords are discovered, fraudsters often have the sense to go and check other websites and check if that combination of both, possibly an email address with a certain password, works. And if passwords are sort of built up on each other, so for example, if you had your basic password as password, but then your more advanced was your password and your date of birth, and then the more advanced was password, date of birth, and maybe your child's Christian name. These sort of combinations again are quite easy for fraudsters to determine, so you have to be very careful. So let's look at a bit more detailed passwords. Now I've put down at least 8 characters, but in recommendations often referred to on the internet, you'll often hear as many as 12 characters minimum. So it's not unusual to have long passwords, because every single character you add doubles the length of time it takes for a fraudster to actually crack your password. So if you have a 4-letter password, that's going to take twice as long as a 3-letter password. So imagine how long it's going to take for an 8-letter password in comparison to a 4-letter password. is not just twice as long, it's multi-factor of 4. So it's 4 times longer. It's very much more secure. Even if you don't use special characters, even if you don't use capitals and small letters and numbers, even just make it simple, it's still making it much more difficult for a fraudster to access your accounts. And definitely avoid common words. Avoid words generally which are in a dictionary, and avoid names and avoid places. People often have a tendency to use passwords which relate to a certain event, such as a child's birth and what have you. And unfortunately, fraudsters can often find this information out using social media and other sources. And you can use, different passwords, if possible, on different types of accounts. So make each password as much as you can, completely unique. Even if that means using a standard password to a point, but then changing it depending on each and every website. Slightest changes make a huge difference. But as unique as possible is definitely as good as best as possible, especially on the financial sites and such like. And it's not a bad idea to consider using a password manager. And the advantage of a password manager is, one, it's built in normally into most browsers. All browsers which you can download these days have a built-in password manager. And what they will do is they'll actually generate a unique and long password for every single site you join. And then they will keep that password encrypted on that computer. And that will be synced to other devices you use, including your phone. So you'll have no issues in getting logged onto devices and sites, but that information will be very secure indeed, with extremely long, possibly even as long as 100+ character long passwords. So here's some examples we've got of the types of phishing emails which you might receive. So for example, you may have an urgent verification email from maybe a bank or financial organization telling you that you need to verify something urgently, for example, giving that impression at all times that you can't leave this, you need to sort this out for some reason, mainly for your own financial gain. In other examples, you might get told that you won a prize draw and then you need to give them information. Unfortunately, that's quite a common ploy these days to get people's details, such as your name, your email address, so that the fraudster then might leave it for a period of time and then come back to you with some information, maybe in the form of a phishing email, using that information they've gained, and maybe other information, because once they've got your name, they can look you up on social media and try and match information with the information they already have. And maybe, you might get some sort of what looks like a routine correspondence, maybe a newspaper subscription, and giving you some sort of link. Anything that gives you a link in an email, you really need to be suspicious of. And many email systems now hide links. They also hide images, because even simple things like images can have some sort of bad thing within them, like such as malware. Unusual, but it's not a bad precaution to take. So you might find email, when it looks at a new email address, even when you think it's an existing email address, when it's misspelt, the computer email system will be able to determine that's a different, unique email recipient, and therefore it will treat it with suspicion until you tell it otherwise. So let's have a look. We're going to look quite a lot today at fake news, because it's quite important that you can understand exactly what you're reading. Are you reading something which is genuine, you can trust it? Are you reading something which is in some way trying to give you sort of misleading or even totally false information? So we will also be looking at how to verify websites. And one of the quickest ways you can do straight away is any website which is secure, which starts the web address with HTTPS, as you can see here. HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is the method used to share websites throughout the internet. But S at the end represents it's a secure website. So in other words, it's actually a website which is using a certificate to secure it, i.e. encrypt the content. So when that information is traveling on the internet itself, it's encrypted so nobody can eavesdrop and read the information in the clear. Now, the advantage of that is these certificates can't just be bought by anyone. They have to be they can only be purchased by verified users, and those verified users have to prove they are genuine. They have to actually issue, tax returns and bank account details and get proof by, their own bank that they are a genuine organisation, how long they've operated. So it's not an easy thing for fraudsters to use, and they can't just use anybody else's certificate. It's unique to that particular content. So let's look at some trusted news sources. So first thing to think about is, can you rely on that outlet? Is it an established outlet you've used in the past? Organisations such as the BBC, Channel 4, TV stations such as those in the UK, you can normally rely on. You know that they're trusted, they've been around for a period of time. So you can rely on that. Also check multiple sources. If you listen or read a news article or have you on one particular source, is it also being published in other sources such as newspapers and TV stations reporting it? If so, again, you can probably have a high certainty of being able to trust that particular organisation or that particular article. And be aware of the sensational headlines you often get in certain newspapers, red banner newspapers particularly. You get a very sort of sensational slant on a story. Even when the story's already been published by other sources, they will tend to modify it to make it more sensational than it possibly really is. And also evaluate the user's credentials. So are these the author's credentials, are these people actually genuine journalists, or are these just maybe modern podcast type journalists? Because there can be a difference in their credibility and the way they treat their newspaper or news sources and what have you. So some examples. So we got, for example, BBC, ITV, Channel 4. As I mentioned already, these can be quite trustworthy. So generally, you'd be fine. Obviously, all organisations can be, can fall for fake news, but at the end of the day, they would do every possible check initially to make sure their stories are correct. And should they then become aware later on, they'll pull the story and they won't sensationalise things, but there's no need to. You get international sort of news organisations such as Reuters who basically make their money out of selling newspaper stories to various organisations such as TV, newspapers, and so on. These again can be quite trustworthy. These are generally based on their reputation, so it's quite important to them that they maintain a good reputation for honesty and trustworthiness. One which often, surprises people is Al Jazeera. Now, Al Jazeera, most people always assume for some reason that it may be some sort of bias towards the Arab states or Muslim community, but in reality, it's very much a sort of BBC of the Asian world. So you definitely can trust Al Jazeera. The areas which you need to worry about when it comes to established media is possibly newspapers. Newspapers can be of many extremes. As I say, some newspapers are only really interested in selling newspapers, sensationalizing stories, and they can be the ones you need to try and be cautious of, especially when they're your only source. If you only read a certain newspaper, then obviously you'll start to believe whatever that newspaper is telling you, and it may not always be the full facts, so you have to be careful. Maybe different sources, different types of newspapers, and that will give you a more rounded view of what news is true and what news can be misinterpreted or even commented on different aspects. Always use these sources as much as you can to sort of protect yourself against fake news. Although, as I say, not 100%. All news sources have in the past been misled. There's many examples. So, importance of trust. Now, it's really important to be able to, be able to trust the sources you read, and the newspapers, both TV, and also maybe podcasts and other sources, information you get, and also to be able to identify those sources to get an idea sometimes. And it's not a bad thing to listen to sources have a certain slant on things, not at all. But it's also good to know that these other sources are probably more genuine and maybe more sort of accurate generally. Although, everyone has their own point of views and which sources they prefer, and that's totally understandable. So, evaluate the author as well is also quite important. Actually, check if the author is a genuine journalist, for example. Check that they've got a history. You can normally find bios on most well-established authors, such as journalists, on, for example, Wikipedia. You can look online for past articles they've written to see if there's a certain slant which they seem to follow, a certain type of politics they seem to be, involved with. And it's also worth checking publications' reputation. There are some sources, particularly on American sites, which actually list the site's reputation. So there are certain sources which can actually guide you on how reputable certain sources can be. So let's just have a little example when we're looking at fake news. A lot of people obviously receive their news not in the form of newspapers, but often in the form of social media. WhatsApp, Facebook, X is now called, used to be Twitter. So there's an example here, and you tell me if you think it's genuine. So obviously we're having a bit of fun here. So obviously William Shakespeare wasn't around when Twitter was around, so therefore he can't have his own Twitter page, or X page as it might be called now. But you can often see, especially celebrities, with multiple websites and multiple social media content, and only one obviously could, of that bunch, be genuine. So you have to be careful which is which. And likewise with newspapers and with many sources, sometimes the headlines themselves can be completely fake, or the headlines can have a grain of truth, but then the story could be wrong. So here's some examples of 5 headlines. So just spend a few seconds. You might want to pause the video and decide which are which, and I'm going to show you in a minute which are correct. So here are the correct fakes. These 3 going across the middle. So Pope Francis didn't endorse Trump, certainly not in the 2016 original election. Lottery winner arrested for dumping £200,000 of manure. It wasn't a true story. I haven't looked into that one, and so on. Some stories are quite true, but sound like they could be wrong. So Goldsmiths University did have a situation where a guest lecturer later was found to have COVID, which unfortunately happened quite often with all of us. And Dubai ruler did indeed kidnap his own child, and indeed keep that child locked up in a very expensive family prison, and it's one of his own estates. And you can read that, and there's been panorama stories and documentaries about that in the UK as well. So some of the sorts of other things you might want to be aware of. So, for example, it's not just fake news in the form of newspapers, TV stories. It can be literally fake adverts. It can be anything can be faked, unfortunately, particularly social media. So here we see, for example, 3 examples. We see possibly there could be photographs which have been doctored in some way. There could be adverts which could be in some way, misleading, and so on. So let's look at the first one. So that is indeed a fake photograph. What's actually happened is somebody photoshopped the cyclist on top of the photograph of the bear running down the road. You can probably get a sense there's something not quite right, because I'm sure that cyclist wouldn't be out cycling in what looks very much like summer wear on what looks very much like a very cold, maybe Antarctic. The yellow signs possibly an American or Canadian scene. So that's probably a completely fake photograph. I'm sure it is. I think it is pretty well been fake checked. Likewise with what looks like a news story, you very often see what appear to be genuine news stories about prices of some device, maybe like a laptop, being amazingly cheap. Mentioning a particular model, cheapest ever, and all the rest. And all they tend to be is unfortunately, adverts for either the manufacturer or maybe a supplier. So you can see here, everything looks like, genuine article, but then we've got the word sponsored, which gives you an idea. And likewise, we've got what looks like Jeremy Clarkson being arrested. But in a minute, we're going to do a lookup of this particular photograph to see where it's been used. And you'll find that, according to Google, it's only actually been used in one place. So it's certainly not a story which has been circulated amongst the press widely. So in that case, you'd probably expect it to be untrue. So we are going to have a look in a minute of how to actually do what's called an image lookup or reverse image search. So a reverse image search is basically taking the image, maybe as a link on the internet original where you found it, or maybe saving it as an actual picture on your hard drive, which both work quite easily. And we actually tell Google to search for that image, and it does a surprisingly good job of finding that particular image. It might find an individual within the image, or it might even find the whole scene itself directly reproduced in another source. So let's see how you do that quite straightforwardly. So first of all, you start off with your normal Google page. And then on your Google page, and depends on which version of Google you're looking at, over the years, it's changed here. On an earlier version of Google, it showed a picture of a camera. And then it gives you a number of choices when you click on that, either to load the URL, which is a link to the original picture on the internet, or to load it actually as an image. So both of which accept drag and drop to copy the information or copy it and paste this, or drag and paste it, whichever you prefer. And once you do that, as you can see, there's an example here. I've just taken a random picture from an old newspaper story, and I've just brought it in, and I brought it into Google, and Google's found a number of sources. Now, the interesting thing about this particular image, this is obviously some sort of conference with politicians, but when you do a reverse image search, it helps you spot any fakes. Now, in this case, it's found that this particular image was used by the Guardian newspaper, and you can see the sort of angle it was taken as. But the BBC used a similar image, possibly from a different angle, which implies that it's certainly a newspaper story which was circulated. And I've got other images which represent the background to the image, representing where that particular image was taken. So I can certainly look at where the original image was taken, and from that information I could probably look ahead and find out when this event, if this event did actually take place. But that's an example. That's the exact image. So that was definitely taken by the Guardian newspaper and definitely used by the BBC. And I'll look further, I'll probably find other images. So I'd be pretty sure that that was a genuine story I was reading. So let's look again at what we were talking about before. We were talking before about malware, and I was saying, if you remember, that malware is possibly the new version of what we used to call viruses. Viruses, as a sort of means of infecting, don't really exist anymore, quite frankly. A virus used to be a computer program which reproduced itself. So it would infect the computer, and within minutes it would have two versions running at once. Within a few minutes later, it'd have 4 versions, 8 versions, and basically it was easily detectable. You'd end up having a computer which is getting slower. You'd have multiple versions of the same program running independently. So it was quite easy to detect, and not an easy, simple way or a good way, if that's a correct analogy to use. But it was a poor way of sort of reproducing and spreading, because basically it became quite obvious you had a computer virus because your computer just got slower and slower. But malware is separate. Malware, you only get infected once, and you get infected via quite legitimate sources. This is the worrying thing with malware. You could be the sort of person who wouldn't dream of going onto maybe a gambling site or an adult entertainment site, and you can still quite easily be infected with malware. Unfortunately, malware is kind of floating out on the internet, and it can infect you quite easily, but yet you can very easily protect yourself against it. And it's one of those things, simple precautions make a big difference. So when we're looking at malware, you could be looking at various types of malware which do bad things, such as ransomware. You may remember the NHS having a huge ransomware attack a couple of years ago where all their computers were encrypted and they couldn't get the information off those computers. We had surgeries being cancelled, or because unfortunately, it only took one person in one trust to download the wrong email, and that then spread via the college, the trust's network onto other computers, and the trusts were having to pay, and it caused huge disruption. You can have spyware, which traditionally sort of spied on you, getting information. Again, going back to what bad guys use for phishing attempts, getting some information about you and trying to address something which might, in some way instill you into doing something you wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. And you can even have adware, which is a sort of, people getting maybe what looks like free software, installing it on their computers, and then unfortunately it's got some sort of, viral content which may take a period of time before it activates, but it will then maybe do something bad. It may be just spying on you. It may be doing something pretty, mundane, but that's something you don't want. So, as I say, viruses not as major an issue as such a true virus, but we still, in many ways, refer to all of this area because there's so many variations. We still generally often refer to it as virus. And certainly when you download and install antivirus software these days, you're not really installing antivirus software in traditional method. You're really installing anti-malware, anti-spyware software to protect you online, particularly. So, quick question. Malware. Does it include software that aims to gain unauthorized access to your device? Yes or no? Well, indeed, it does. It does, in fact, have that capability. You can install malware on your device, which then gets access to your device. And once it's accessing your device, it can then basically spy on you. You can take copies of your details, your passwords, and previous information and transfer them to somebody else. So you do need to be very, very careful. Now, let's look further about securing yourselves. Now, some of this might be more appropriate for others than maybe yourself, but it's still worth knowing about. And some of this, for example, might be a benefit generally to everyone. So the first thing sounds quite technical, but you can actually download what's called a virtual private network. It's a VPN which encrypts everything coming out of your computer when it goes on the internet. The beauty of that is that no matter what comes out, all it can be decrypted by is the actual site at the other end. So nobody can spy on you. Nobody can sort of look at the content on the internet, not even on the same company or college network. So your device is particularly, encrypted. And a lot of devices now have a built-in VPN software which allows that to be automatically turned on, or as an option, which might be a small charge, maybe a monthly charge, but that will definitely give you a huge level of increased security. You can obviously, we've talked about looking at antivirus software. You can also extend that with what's called firewalls and other security types of software, which is ran on your particular computer also. Most important of all, regularly install your device. So if you've got a Windows computer, as I spoke about earlier, every third Tuesday of every month, you will get updates, if not sooner. If Microsoft ever find a loophole or some sort of security vulnerability, they will always release an update as soon as possible. But routinely, there will normally be updates every third Tuesday of every month. And you can turn that on to automatically update. And when we're doing things online, you can turn on a very good feature called two-factor authentication. So two-factor authentication is basically a way of it's proving you are who you say you are. So when, for example, you go to a shopping site you've been to before and create an account, you can turn this two-factor authentication on, which will then actually show a prompt on another device. So it might send a prompt or send a code to maybe your email or maybe your smartphone. And that information then you have to put onto the first device to prove that you are who you say you are. Now, obviously, if you're a hacker, you will not be able to get that information. That information will go to the genuine owner of that account. So that then also will notify the owner that somebody's trying to access their account. And not only accessing their account, but they're trying to do it with at least maybe the username and password. They got through the first level of security. They haven't just simply gone and said, an email. They've actually tried to get password. There may be a password or some other part of the security. So this is the second layer, the second factor to prove. So it doesn't just let the user through just by proving with their username and address, password. This is the second stage. So let's look at some quick summary. So when it comes to online threats, so obviously phishing, malware, fake news, we need to be obviously very conscious of these things. You need some sort of consideration of setting your password to quite a strong password, maybe using as a way, say, a password manager, which automatically will generate very, very strong passwords and automatically store them so that you never read the password, see the password. It automatically puts the password in to whichever site you're on, and it works across different web browsers, different devices such as phones and computers and so on. And also securing your password, which is what we've looked at with the VPN and using the firewall. And we will be looking obviously in a bit about online shopping in particular, but using second factor authentication to verify that you're a website, but also looking at websites and making sure they have certificates, making sure that they're not just HTTP but HTTPS websites, so that they are by fact that they've got certificates, they've proved to some second or third party that they are a genuine site, and that can't be faked in any way. That is trustworthy. So quick quiz. So what are the 2 signs of a phishing email? I'll let you try and answer these when you're home. Why is it important to update your devices regularly? And how can you identify fake news?